I'd like for us to open our Bibles, if you will, to Mark chapter 10. Mark chapter 10. And we're going to begin reading in this lesson today one of the many occasions where Jesus was being tested by his enemies. And on this occasion we read in Mark chapter 10, beginning in verse 2, these words. And some Pharisees came up to him, testing him, and began to question him whether it was lawful for a man to divorce a wife. And he answered and said to them, What did Moses command you? And they said, Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away. But Jesus said to them, Because of your hardness of heart, he wrote you this commandment. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. And for this cause a man shall leave his father and mother, and the two shall become one flesh. Consequently, they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. And in the house the disciples began questioning him about this again. And he said to them, Whoever divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she herself divorces her husband and marries another man, she is committing adultery. It was the Pharisees who came to Jesus with this question regarding divorce. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? We sometimes wonder who these people were who kept pestering the Lord, the Pharisees. And most of us who are here today understand who the Pharisees are. We've grown up learning about these people, but there are a lot of people in the world who read the Bible and they wonder, who are these people? Who are these people that the Lord keeps dealing with and having to talk to and speak to? Who are the Pharisees? Well, in Jesus' day, the Jews were divided into various sectarian groups. It was not meant to be this way. The law never authorized such a division, but this is the way it was nevertheless. And in the days of Jesus, there were basically three groups that were kind of the popular groups. Three groups that were predominant among all the others. And these groups were, of course, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes. And the Pharisees of that group were by far the most influential of the groups. The others had some influence, but not so much as the Pharisees. And I believe that Paul's words in Acts chapter 26, turn there if you will, reveal to us and illustrate for us that the Pharisees, even above the Essenes and the Sadducees, were considered the most conservative of all the others. And in Acts 26, beginning in verse 4, this is what Paul says. Acts 26, beginning in verse 4, giving a defense for himself, he says, So then all the Jews know my manner of life from my youth up, which from the beginning was spent among my own nation and at Jerusalem. Since they have known about me for a long time previous, if they are willing to testify that I lived as a Pharisee according to the strictest sect of our religion. And so Paul's mind, the Pharisees were the strictest of all the sectarian groups. The most conservative, if you will. And that word I do deliberately put in inverted commas. That was the way the Jews saw the Pharisees. The most strictest of the sects of the Jews. And these were the ones who came to the Lord on that occasion in Mark chapter 10 to ask the question regarding divorce. Now this is not the first time the Lord had dealings with these people. As we read through the Gospels, and particularly Mark, since we're in there this morning, we find them coming across them over and over and over again. Mark, for example, records at least 5 other occasions where he had a conflict with the Jews, where there was somehow a coming together and somehow some kind of a controversy because of these Jews. For example, in Mark chapter 8, beginning in verse 11, we learn that they begin to argue with him, seeking for him a sign from heaven. And so they argue with him. They come to him and they argue. And that's how they deal with Jesus. They want to argue with him. They want to dispute with him regarding various things. But then in Mark chapter 3 and verse 2, we see that they don't argue with him at all, but they're listening to him. Listening to see if he'll say something that's wrong. Turn there, if you will, to Mark chapter 3. This has to do with the healing of a man that was in the synagogue on this occasion. And in Mark chapter 3 and in verse 2, this is how Mark records the event. And they were watching him to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath in order that they might accuse him. And so that was what the Jews were doing. They were looking at Jesus and this man who was ill, and this was on the Sabbath day, and they were looking intently to see, is he going to break the law? Is he going to heal this man on the Sabbath day? Which in their mind would be a breaking of law. I mean, for crying out loud, there's 6 days to be made well. Just forget about it on the Sabbath day. That was the way they thought about it anyway. And once Jesus healed this man from his illness, we then learn that what they did in verse 6 was that they went out and immediately began to conspire with the Herodians against him as how they might destroy him. So they formed an allegiance with another sectarian group, a smaller one than the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes, but still a popular one among certain people, the Herodians, who really in essence were the exact opposite of the Pharisees. The Pharisees would have had no dealings ordinarily with the Herodians. The Herodians were the political party. They were the ones who supported Herod. With the Pharisees would never have wanted to support him. Imagine living among a people who were always testing you, and hoping that they might find some fault against you. How could you live among such people as that? Boy, they'd have so much to say against me. Always looking, testing, wondering, what are we going to catch him this time? How are we going to find, what are we going to find wrong with his teaching? What are we going to do? And this is the kind of people Jesus was living among. These were the Pharisees, always watching, always looking, always hoping for an opportunity to make him look bad, to make him look like a sinner, to make him look like a lawbreaker. And so when they come to Jesus on this occasion, they're testing him. Mark says it right out. They come testing him, and they ask the question, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Now, in Matthew's account, Matthew gives a fuller account of the question. In Matthew's account, in Matthew 19, it says, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? And that's Matthew 19 in verse 3. The difference between these two narratives is really very simple. In Mark's account, he is addressing people who need the grounding in the general law of God. He's writing to people who are not really familiar with God's law on much of anything. And so he's giving what Jesus said regarding the general rule. The general rule is a man must not divorce his wife. That is the rule. In Matthew's account, he is writing to people who have some respect for the law of God, but they had a misunderstanding of what the law said regarding marriage. And so he broadens the question, is it lawful to divorce your wife for any reason at all? And of course, in that account, Jesus says, no, again, it's not lawful to do that except for one thing, and that is adultery. So Matthew and Mark are writing to different audiences. And so Mark just gives the general question, is it lawful to divorce your wife? And Jesus responds, I think, and in a way that really teaches us how to respond to questions. He says, well, what does the law say? What did Moses say? Let me tell you what, we need to remember that answer. Not that everything has to do with what Moses said, but when somebody asks us a question, we need to respond by saying, what does the Bible say? What does the Scripture say? Because in essence, that's what the Lord does here. The Lord is not going to become involved in the disputes of the day that they wanted him to, perhaps. They did not want to... He did not want to get involved in questions that would kind of align him in an awkward way with any group. He wants to align himself with the Bible. He wants to align himself with what Moses said. So he asked the question, what did Moses command you? In Mark chapter 3 and in verse 3. And then they respond by saying, well, Moses said, or Moses permitted a man to divorce. Or let me read that again. Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away. But Jesus said to them, because of your hardness of heart, He wrote you this command. And so they respond by referring to what Moses said. And again, that is not necessarily an incorrect answer, because they're really kind of going and answering what Jesus said. What did Moses say? And they quote from Deuteronomy 24. And a lot of us aren't familiar with this verse. Again, some of us are, but some of us aren't. But turn if you will to Deuteronomy 24, where we find what the Jews were quoting from. They were quoting from the law of God regarding divorce and regarding what God said about it. And listen to what He says. When a man takes a wife, verse 1, and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes, because he has found some indecency in her, and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out from his house, and she leaves his house and goes and becomes another man's wife, and if the latter husband turns against her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies, who took her as to be his wife, then the former husband who sent her away is not allowed to take her again to be his wife, since she has been defiled. For that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance. Now Jesus here does not deny that Moses wrote these verses and wrote these words. And neither does he deny that these verses have something to say about divorce. I mean, they do, most certainly do. But what he says about this passage is revealing. He reveals to us that this is not really the thing that Moses wrote, which expresses God's will on the subject. That's what Jesus says. They respond by saying, well, Moses said this. And he responds by saying, well, Moses gave you that because of your hardness of heart. And so in saying that, he's revealing to the Jews that this really isn't what Moses said that reveals God's intention for the marriage. This isn't the verse to go to for that. Yes, Moses wrote the scripture which allows a man to divorce his wife because of some indecency. And the debate among the religious scholars of that day was what constitutes an indecency. And I will not become embroiled in that controversy except to say that whatever it was, and listen carefully, whatever this indecency was, it was not adultery. Whatever this indecency was, it was not adultery. Because God had a law regarding adultery. And what God said about adultery was not you divorce your wife. What God said about adultery was that the adulterer and the adulteress shall be put to death. And again, so we may know that this is what is truly written, turn if you will to Leviticus chapter 20 and verse 10, where God specifically tells us what the punishment for adultery is. In Leviticus chapter 20 and verse 10, God is speaking to this issue, and He says in verse 10 these words, if there is a man who commits adultery with another man's wife, one who commits adultery with his friend's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress shall be put to death. That is God's law regarding adultery. It's not divorce. And in another occasion, I believe it's Numbers, I didn't write it down in my notes, I should have. But on another occasion, the law actually deals with the suspicion of adultery. What happens when you're suspicious of it? Well, there was also a law about that as well. And it wasn't divorce. It wasn't divorce. It was he was brew up some kind of something to drink, and if this thing had a negative effect on her and caused her to die, become very sick and die, well, then she's guilty. But if it didn't, then she lived. Now again, that's found in Numbers. I just can't think of where it's found at the moment. But I want to point out that adultery had different laws. Whatever this indecency was in Deuteronomy, it had nothing to do with adultery. Because the law of God regarding adultery was very clear. and very succinct. The adulterer and the adulteress shall be put to death. It wasn't divorce. So whatever this indecency was, and I have to confess, I wouldn't have a clue as to what he's talking about here. It wasn't adultery. Though Deuteronomy 24 is written by Moses, it is not Deuteronomy 24 which expresses God's will on the subject of divorce. God gave His will to Moses on this occasion through a concession to the nation due to their hardness of heart. That's what Jesus said. This was not given. This is not God's intent. This is not God's will. This was given because of your hardness of heart. What was God's will regarding the permanency of marriage? Well, Moses spoke about that earlier on in Genesis. Right in the very beginning when he deals with marriage for the first time. In Genesis, in the first couple of chapters. Turn there, if you will, to Genesis. And in chapter 1 and verse 27, and then also in chapter 2, verses 23 through 24, we see what Moses said. And by the way, this is what Jesus quotes from. Let me read what Jesus said in Mark 10. And I'll read it to you while you turn to the other verses, or you can keep your finger there and go back to Mark 10. But he says, beginning of verse 6, these words. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. That's a quotation from Genesis 1:27. God made them male and female. And then he says, and for this cause a man shall leave his father and his mother, and the two shall become one flesh. Consequently, they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God is joined together, let no man separate. In verses 7 and the first part of verse 8, he quotes from Genesis chapter 2, 23 through 24, where it says, God made them male and female. Or verse 24, where it says, for this cause a man shall leave his father and mother, and the two shall become one flesh. And that's taken from Genesis 2, 23 through 24. That is what Moses originally wrote about marriage. That is what he wrote regarding the permanency of marriage. God did not make, it says in Genesis chapter 1:27, God created man in His own image. The image of God created He him. Male and female, He created them. And then he says, he takes the woman and all this. But let me just point out, from these verses we learn that God did not take one woman and several men to form a marriage. He did not take one man and several women to form a marriage. And neither did He take one woman and one woman to form a marriage, or one man to form a marriage. He took one man and one woman, and He said, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and they shall cleave to one another and become one flesh. They will be joined together as husband and wife and become one flesh. Jesus here is telling us what happened in the beginning and what God's intention for marriage was. The taking of one man, one woman, bringing them together to form one flesh. And then He talks about the solemnity of the marriage, the seriousness of the event, of what it's all about. He says, what therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. God has joined these people together. God has brought these individuals together. And He said, what God has joined together, let no man separate. That is the rule regarding divorce. That was what God said in the beginning according to the Lord. God had ruled on the whole issue of divorce in the beginning, and Moses recorded His words for future generations. And so Jesus' answer to this to this question was that marriage is a once and for all lifetime relationship. And that comes when He quotes, what God has joined together, let no man separate. That is what brings out the solemnity of this whole thing. And they become one flesh, and Jesus says, let nobody separate this flesh. So then the answer to the question then is it lawful to divorce your wife? And if we add Matthew's account, for any reason at all? The answer is simple, no, it's not lawful. That was the answer the Lord gave on this occasion. It's just not lawful. Now, was it common? Indeed it was. It was very common. It was so common in the days of Malachi that the prophet actually brings a case against Israel for this and said, God hates divorce. And he says that one of the things God has against you people was that you're just breaking the covenant of the wife of your youth and treating her so badly by just putting her away. It was a problem in the first century. And this was a test. Can you imagine? The test that would be for us today, was divorce so prevalent in the land, for somebody asking, Jesus, is it lawful to divorce your wife for any cause at all? Or is it lawful to divorce? And we think, boy, it's bad today. It was bad back then too. Divorce was common. Very common. There was a lot of bad marriages. A lot of ugly marriages. And so to ask this question would truly be a test even today. I guarantee when people ask that question today to us, it's a test. They want to know if we're really that conservative, if we're really taking this that seriously. And they want to know what we believe about this, so normally they can throw things against us and say how heartless and how mean-spirited we are. But it was a test then, and it will surely be a test today. But the answer is simple. The Lord says very clearly that it is not lawful. God has made them one flesh. That's Moses' statement from the beginning. And what God has joined together, let no man separate. So no, it is not lawful to divorce your wife. It is not lawful to do that. And so Jesus brings that up. Now Jesus does subsequently mention or answer a question regarding the exception to the rule. I mean, he does bring that up in Matthew's account, and I just want to mention it so you all know it's there and I know it's there. He did say, except for fornication. Except for fornication, a man who divorces his wife is sinning. But that's the exception, not the rule. That is the exception and not the rule. And then he goes on and says a little bit about remarriage. He says, and those who divorce their wives and marry somebody else, they're just committing adultery. In fact, that's what he says in Mark, and that's what really gets the apostles, or Matthew and Mark, and that really what gets the apostles all wrapped up and upset. Because their point is, well, if this is the way it is, it's better not to marry. If you just can't put away your wife for any cause at all, it's just better not to marry. And there are a lot of men who felt that way, and there are a lot of women who feel that way. There are people who say, I've heard them say, well, if this doesn't work out, we'll just get a divorce. Has anybody in this audience never not heard that, or just not heard that at all? We've all heard that. We've all heard that from somebody. If it doesn't work out, just get a divorce. And so Jesus says to the people, to the Pharisees, or pardon me, to the apostles who are disturbed by this teaching, he says, well, he said, not everybody can accept what you're saying. Some can, some can't. But he says, but not everybody can accept that and be eunuchs and live as eunuchs. But Jesus teaches very clearly that divorce without the cause of fornication is unlawful. It is not lawful to do that. Now, somebody may ask, well, what about? You know, you always hear, what about? And sometimes people say, what about 1 Corinthians 7? What about 1 Corinthians 7, verses 10 through 11? Doesn't Paul give another exception to the rule regarding divorce? And 1 Corinthians 7, beginning in verse 10, in this whole section here, he's dealing with marriage actually. They had asked him a question regarding it. And they say, he says to them, but to the married I give instructions, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not leave her husband. And then in a parenthesis, and I really believe this is somewhat a parenthesis of thought, he says, but if she does leave, let her remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband. And then he says, and that the husband should not send his wife away. And they say, what about that? Doesn't the Bible say that if she does depart, That she just needs to just live unmarried and or be reconciled to her husband? Doesn't that mean that there's another exception, that it's okay for her to do that? And I'm here to tell you, that's not what this verse is saying. That's not what this verse is saying. It's a common thought that this verse is saying it's okay to get a divorce provided you don't marry again, or provided you work toward reconciliation. But it's okay to get a divorce without fornication, provided you just remain unmarried. Let me tell you something. That is not what the Lord is saying here at all. The Lord is not giving another exception to the rule. What does the Lord command in these verses? Look again at verse 11. Or pardon me, verse 11. He says here to the woman, He said, I give instructions, not I but the Lord, indicating that He's going to refer back to something that the Lord specifically dealt with. Mark 10, Matthew 19, those verses. And what does He say? He says that the wife should not leave her husband. That's what the Lord said. And then, what does He say to the man? At the end of verse 11, He says here that the husband should not divorce or leave his wife. That's the rule. That's the rule. And he just quotes and tells us what the Lord said back in Mark 10, Matthew 19, and other places like that. That is what He wants. Now let me ask the question. Can a wife then divorce her husband without sinning? Can a wife divorce her husband without sinning, according to this verse? Or can a husband just put away his wife without sinning? Now, Paul is not dealing with the exception here. You need to follow along his thoughts here. My questions are rhetorical, I hope. And if you don't think they are, then you need to rethink the whole verse and be thinking about this. The answer is no. The wife who divorces her husband is sinning. The husband who divorces his wife is sinning. Because what was the command of the Lord? Don't divorce. Don't leave. Don't send him away. And if you do that, you have sinned. Well, what about the next verse? If she does do this, doesn't that mean that if she does, it's okay? The answer is no. No. The Lord here, through the Apostle Paul, is teaching us about how not to make things worse than what they really are, and what they are in the first place. And what he's telling these people here on this occasion is don't make matters worse. If she does leave, then here's what she must do. But if she does leave, she has broken the will of God in the matter. And what he's telling her is that she is not to make things worse. She is to remain unmarried or be reconciled. There are a lot of verses like this in the Bible with similar construction, like we have here, where we find a command of the Lord given. And then we find a but if you will. But if you ignore what I say and do it anyway, then be careful about this. And it's constructed in that sort of way. Look, if you will, to Galatians chapter 5 and verse 14. And notice this one here. And again, I'm not saying that the Greek here is exactly like, but the construction, the grammar is what he's saying. His argument it is. In Galatians 5 and in verse 14, notice what Paul is saying here in verse 14 of Galatians 5. He says, verse 14, for the whole law is fulfilled in one word, in the statement, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's the command. Right? Love your neighbor as yourself. Now look at the next verse. But if you bite and devour one another. Now, what do you do if you bite and devour one another? You're breaking the commandment to love your neighbor. But if you do that, you've sinned. But then what does he next say? He says, be careful that you don't devour one another. You see what he does here? He's not saying it's okay to bite and devour one another, provided you don't, or bite, what's the word he uses? Bite and devour one another, provided you don't be consumed by the others. You know, it's okay to bite and devour, just don't consume your brother. We all know he's not saying that. That's silly. What he's saying is, love your neighbor, love your brother. And if you do this, bite and devour, be careful. Don't do this. But he's not saying it's okay to bite and devour. And this is the kind of construction we have here. There's another place here in Romans chapter 11 where there's a similar construction of the grammar. In Romans 11, beginning in verse 18, he's talking to the Jews who were, or pardon me, the Gentiles who were engrafted into the branch, under the branch, the olive branch, if you will, and the Jews were cut off. And he's telling the Gentile Christians, the non-Jewish Christians, he's saying to them in verse 18, do not be arrogant toward the branches. And that's the branches that were cut off, the Jewish branches. Don't be arrogant toward the branches. As if somehow you're better than they are. As if somehow you're more secure than they are. Because as it goes on down later on to show that they were cut off for unbelief, and you will be cut off too if you don't continue in the faith. So he kind of, don't be arrogant. Just because you've been grafted in doesn't mean you can't be cut off if you act like they acted. So he said, don't be arrogant. He says in verse 18, toward the branches. But if you are arrogant, okay, if you are, you've sinned. Because the command is what? Don't be arrogant. But if you are, he says in verse 18, he said, remember that it is not you who supports the root, but the root supports you. In other words, it can take you to a point where you think that you have a wrong thinking about your about the whole affair of Abraham being the kind of the root and being all that. But he's not saying it's okay to be arrogant, provided you don't forget this. And that's the same thing in 1 Corinthians 7. When he gives a command and said, don't leave, don't depart, and then he said, but if she does, he's not saying it's okay that she does. Or he does. But what is being said here is that if that happens, don't make it worse and do this. Don't make it worse and remarry. He said, if this happens, you need to remain unmarried. Or be reconciled to your husband. There's a consequence to this. You know, what's the consequence of divorce very often? It's adultery. A man divorces his wife for any cause at all, and then he makes her an adulteress. According to Matthew 5, he makes her an adulteress. And what way does he make her an adulteress? Well, here's this woman is, and she's alone, and she needs companionship, like all people do. And she's driven into the arms of another man on this occasion because you have left her. You've put her away. And you have made her this. Your actions have caused her to do this. It's not excusing what she does, but you have made her so. There's a consequence to things we do. And when we divorce our mates, there's a consequence. And therefore, the temptation will be to marry again. To find another mate. And Paul says, no, all that will do is make things worse. Now you have another family to cope with. And now you have another problem that needs to be dealt with. So stay unmarried. Or be reconciled to your husband. This is what the Lord teaches on these things. Now let me just say, this message today, it will be no more popular in our time than it would be, than it was in the days of Jesus. Today, it may be even worse. We have all kind of divorce going on for all kind of reasons. But there's only one reason for it, according to God. And that's for fornication. And if there's no fornication, then there can be no divorce scripturally. And those who divorce sin. And I realize there are all these, well, what about this? What about this? Don't you think they had those what ifs in the days of the Lord as well? And yet, they never soften the teachings on this matter. Well, you know, I've got to get a divorce for financial reasons. I've heard that before in many places. No. You need to trust in the Lord. Not that perhaps your mate will give you what you need, but the Lord will take care of you. And that may sound glib. That may sound like a cliche. But where does trusting the Lord come in? To do the will of the Lord, and I'm not going to break the law of God, do that which He has forbidden, for the sake, well, I just got to do this in order to be provided for. Where's trust in the Lord come in? Where we do the will of the Lord. I'm not unsympathetic toward people who are in bad marriages. Not at all. But I am very more sympathetic toward what the Lord said about marriage. And people who are in bad marriages have my great sympathy. Great sympathy. And I work with them and I try to encourage them in the right, godly way. But if they come and they say, well, but I need to get a divorce. I say, I don't know if that's true or not. In fact, it would be contrary to what God said. But I need a divorce to protect myself. Well, I always forget what you call it here in this country, in America. But in Ireland we call it barring orders. And you can kind of get an idea of what that means. Where you are barred from seeing somebody, and it's a court thing. Sometimes we may need that from our wives or our husbands who are violent toward us. We may need barring orders to keep them away from us. And if that's the case, then you go ahead and do that. And then work toward reconciliation in the future, where he is forced to go or she is forced or whatever, and you work to reconcile. But to divorce, there's no authority for it. There's no right to do it. Not even for that. We just need to trust in the Lord that He will take care of the financial situation for us. And He will do that. The Lord is good, and the Lord will take care of His people who put their trust in Him. I realize that this is a hard teaching for many of us. And it is hard to preach it. Because the hearts of people go out to people who are in poor marriages. When you're in a good marriage and you see things going south in other people's marriages, it just breaks your heart. It breaks your heart. And you just, if they could only have the kind of marriage that I have. Not perfect always, but a good marriage. And you pray for these people, and it breaks your heart. But we must understand what the Lord says on these issues, and we must not give support to those who may be in this situation to divorce. Give them support, for sure. Hold them up. Give them good advice, godly advice. But let us not encourage them to do that which they have no lawful right to do. And that way there will encourage them in the right way and encourage them to put their trust in the Lord, which is not always an easy thing to do. As I said a few months ago when I was talking about the real threat to marriage, we were talking about homosexual marriage and all this, and the real threat to marriage is not homosexuality. The real threat to marriage is what we've been talking about this morning. Just divorce. Wholesale divorce, where people just break their marriages and get out of marriages so freely. That is a threat to marriage, and that is to our shame. To our shame. Our society sees marriage as just such an easy thing to get into and an easy thing to get out of. And it ought not to be that way, especially among Christians, especially among ourselves. So think about these things. Hopefully, I know this lesson was not meant to be one that would make us happy. It does not make us happy in the sense of I'm going to be happy when I leave here. But it is meant to make us be sober. To be sober about these things. We need to be teaching our children from the time they are just in our arms about how good marriage is. Be careful about being married. Marry the person that is godly, one that you can submit to if you're a woman, and one that you can trust in if you're a man. We need to be teaching that and encouraging it, and then we need to be living it in our own homes. And if we happen to be from a home where the marriage has dissolved, and we need to do the best we can, even in that situation with our children, letting them know what God has said about marriage and do what we can. It's such a serious thing, and it's such a plague. Sadly, it's even a plague among the people of God. Well, anyway, if you're here today and you're subject to the invitation of the gospel, if you've never obeyed, it's a time to obey. And if you've lived your life ungodly, get it right with the Lord. And if you need to ask for prayers and help from us, we'll pray with you and for you as we stand and sing the last song.